Captain Lee Hyun was drinking his morning coffee when the emergency alarm started blaring through the UES determination. It was 4 in the morning, and most of the crew was still sleeping. But this wasn't a drill. Park Mina, the communications officer, ran onto the bridge with her hair still messy from sleep. Her face was pale as she handed him the data pad. "Captain, you need to see this right away." The message had traveled across the galaxy from a place called Kepler 442. Hyun had never heard of it before, but what he read made his stomach drop. An entire alien species was about to die, not from war or disease, but because their sun was killing itself. The Vorthok lived in the oceans of their world. They looked like giant sea creatures with tentacles and beautiful blue skin that glowed underwater. For millions of years, they had built their cities beneath the waves, raising their children in the safe depths of their seas. But now their star was going crazy, getting hotter and hotter every day. "The water is already starting to boil in some places," Park Mina explained, her voice shaking. 2 billion of them, Captain. That's more people than we have on Earth. Hey, watched the video footage that came with the message. Vorthok families were swimming deeper and deeper, trying to escape the heat. Their children stayed close to their parents, scared and confused. The alien kids reminded him of his own daughter back home. The Galactic Coalition had already given up. All the smart alien species with their fancy technology said it was impossible to save the Vorthok. The Coalition ships were already packing up and leaving the system. They said there was nothing anyone could do. For months, Park Mina continued reading from the report. That's how long before the planet becomes completely uninhabitable. The oceans will boil away completely. Other crew members were gathering on the bridge now, having heard the alarms. Engineer Choi Daeho looked at the data and whistled low. 2 billion people. That's like trying to evacuate everyone from Earth and Mars combined. Where would they even go? Asked Navigator Kim Sora. The report says their biology is super specific. They can't just live in any ocean. Hyun kept staring at the screen, showing Vorthok families huddled together in their dying world. Every instinct told him this was impossible. Every logical part of his brain said they should listen to the Coalition and stay away. But there was another part of him, the part that made him human, that couldn't accept giving up on 2 billion innocent lives. The bridge was quiet except for the humming of the ship's engines. Everyone was waiting for his decision. As captain, he could order them to ignore the message and continue their current mission. It would be the smart choice, the safe choice. Instead, he stood up and walked to the navigation console. Kim Sora, plot a course for Kepler 442, maximum speed. "Sir," Park Mina said carefully, "Earth Command hasn't authorized this mission. We don't have permission to." "They will," Hyun interrupted, his voice firm but not angry. He was thinking about his daughter again, about what he would want someone to do if she needed help. "Send a message to Earth. Tell them the Vorthok need us, and we're going to help them." The crew exchanged glances. They all knew this could end their careers, but they also knew their captain, and they trusted him. Message sent. "Captain," Park Mina reported a few minutes later, as the UES determination changed course toward the dying Kepler system. Hyun wondered if humanity could really pull off the impossible. But one thing he knew for certain, they had to try. Dr. Kim Ji-won had studied alien biology for 15 years, but she had never seen anything like this. Her hands were shaking as she ran the water sample through the scanner for the 3rd time, hoping the results would be different. They weren't. She was standing on the observation deck of the research vessel hovering above the Vorthok homeworld. Below them, the alien ocean stretched endlessly, but it was nothing like Earth's seas. The water was a strange purple color, and steam was rising from the surface as the dying star heated it up. "This can't be right," she muttered, staring at her readings. The water was so acidic it would dissolve human skin in seconds, but somehow the Vorthok thrived in it. Their biology had evolved over millions of years to need this exact chemical mixture. Engineer Choi Daeho floated over in zero gravity, looking worried. How bad is it, Doc? Ji-won connected to the emergency hologram meeting with Earth Command. Scientists and military officers appeared as blue projections around her. She took a deep breath and delivered the worst news possible. The Vorthok can't live anywhere else in the galaxy, she announced. Their water isn't just special, it's completely unique. The mineral composition includes elements that don't naturally occur together anywhere else we know of. Admiral Song Minji's hologram leaned forward from Earth. Explain it in simple terms, Doctor. Imagine humans needed to breathe a gas that only existed on one planet, Ji-won said. That's what we're dealing with. Even if we found another ocean, world, they'd die within days. Their gills would shut down, their organs would fail. The silence in the meeting was deafening. Choi Daeho was frantically calculating on his tablet. What about creating artificial environments, like giant aquariums? Ji-won almost laughed, but not because it was funny. For 2 billion people, do you understand how big that would have to be? We're talking about building artificial oceans the size of continents, and keeping them at exactly the right temperature, pressure, and chemical balance. She pulled up a projection showing the energy requirements. The numbers were staggering. It would take more power than our entire solar system produces just to maintain the life support systems. And that's not even counting the construction. Dr. Park Sung-min, Earth's top engineer, shook his head. The materials alone would require strip mining half the asteroid belt. The construction time would be decades, even with our best technology. We have 14 weeks. Admiral Song reminded them grimly. Lieutenant Commander Yoon Ji-yoon spoke up from the Mars base. Maybe we should face reality here. If the coalition species with their advanced technology say it's impossible, maybe it really is. But Ji-won noticed something in Admiral Song's eyes. The older woman was staring at the data, but she wasn't looking defeated. She was looking determined. Dr. Kim, Admiral Song said quietly, I want you to start designing those floating cities. Anyway. The room erupted in protests. Admiral, with respect, the math doesn't work, Dr. Park argued. Choi, Song continued, ignoring the objections. I need construction timelines, best case scenario, worst case scenario, and everything in between. Ji-won felt her heart racing. Admiral, you're talking about the largest construction project in human history, times 10. Song's expression didn't change. I'm talking about saving 2 billion lives. The coalition gave up because they looked at this problem with logic. We're going to look at it with stubbornness. The meeting fell completely silent. Then, one by one, people started reaching for their tablets and data pads. Ji-won realized that Admiral Song had just committed humanity to attempting the impossible. 14 weeks, Choi muttered, already sketching preliminary designs. We'll need every shipyard, every factory, every construction crew in human space. Ji-won looked down at the dying Vorthok world below. Somewhere in those purple seas, children were playing. Not knowing their entire species was counting on a bunch of crazy humans to save them. She opened her design software and started drawing the first floating city. The call went out across human space at exactly midnight, Earth time. Within 3 days, something incredible happened that the galaxy had never seen before. An entire species dropped everything to help complete strangers. Han Jisoo was sleeping in her luxury apartment on Ceres when her assistant woke her up with the emergency message from Earth. She owned the biggest asteroid mining company in the solar system, with a fleet of massive ships designed to haul tons of ice and rock. After reading the message, she didn't even hesitate. Convert everything, she told her confused operations manager over the video call. Every ship, every hauler, every transport. We're not mining asteroids anymore. We're collecting water for the Her manager blinked in confusion. Ma'am, that will cost us millions of credits in lost contracts. Han Jisoo was already getting dressed. The Vorthok children don't eat credits. Similar scenes were playing out everywhere humans lived. On Mars, retired Admiral Yoon Seok Min got the same message. He had been enjoying his peaceful retirement, tending to his garden in the Mars colony domes. But when he saw the footage of dying Vorthok families, something stirred in his old warrior heart. "Sir, those ships have been in storage for 20 years. His former aide protested as Yoon started calling up his old crew. "Half of them probably won't even start." "Then we'll fix them," Yoon replied, already pulling on his old uniform. "I didn't serve 40 years in the fleet to watch innocent people die." Back on Earth, the government was in chaos. The emergency council session had been going on for 18 hours straight, with politicians arguing about costs, risks, and legal problems. "This plan is completely insane," Councillor Park Ga shouted, waving a datapad full of calculations. "We're talking about dismantling half our space stations, converting our entire merchant fleet, and spending more money than our last 3 wars combined." President Kim Soyeon stood up slowly. She was a small woman, but when she spoke, the entire room went quiet. "Then we dismantle it all. The Vorthok children don't have time for our politics or our budgets." Within hours of that decision, something magical started happening. Human ships began appearing in the Kepler system like they were coming out of nowhere. Old cargo haulers that had been hauling grain between colonies suddenly showed up loaded with construction materials. Military ships that had been patrolling trade routes abandoned their posts and came, carrying massive steel beams. Even civilian ships joined the effort. Passenger liners dumped their luxury suites and filled the space with habitat modules. Private yachts belonging to rich families arrived carrying specialized equipment their owners had bought with their own money. The alien observers couldn't believe what they were seeing. A tall, blue-skinned Altarian named Zeftai was stationed in the system to report on the situation to his government. He watched in amazement as more human ships arrived every few hours. "This makes no sense," he told his superiors over the quantum communicator. "They're bringing construction equipment for building artificial oceans in space. With their primitive technology, this cannot possibly work." But even as he spoke, the humans were already proving him wrong. They had started connecting their ships together in orbit, creating massive construction platforms. Welding sparks lit up space as thousands of human workers began building something the galaxy had never seen before. Dr. Kim Gi-won, still orbiting the Vorthok homeworld, watched the construction effort with tears in her eyes. "Look at them," she whispered to Engineer Choi, who was working beside her. 3 days ago, most of these people had never heard of the Vorthok. Now they're risking everything to save them. The impossible was becoming possible, one human ship at a time. The scale of what humanity was attempting had never been seen before in galactic history. Across human space, entire colonies were literally taking themselves apart to save strangers they had never met. On Mars, 8-year-old Kim Nari watched through her bedroom window as construction crews carefully removed the outer sections of their dome. She tugged on her father Lee Sun-ho's sleeve, her eyes wide with worry. "Papa, where will we live if they take our house apart?" she asked. Sun-ho knelt down and hugged his daughter, pointing at the hologram showing Vorthok children swimming in their dying oceans. "See those little ones, Nari? Their whole world is disappearing. We can build new walls, but they can't build a new planet." The little girl looked at the alien children, then back at the workers removing their dome panels. "Can I give them my room too?" Similar conversations were happening everywhere humans lived. On Luna City, the massive orbital ring that had taken 50 years to build was being carefully disassembled. Each section was loaded onto cargo ships and sent toward the Kepler system. "My grandfather helped build that ring," said Engineer Park Ji-woo, as she supervised the removal of a 3-kilometer section. "He'd understand why we're doing this." Even the famous Saturn research station, where humanity's greatest scientists had worked for decades, donated their habitat modules. Dr. Choi Moran, the station director, personally oversaw the removal of laboratories that had cost billions to build. Science is about saving lives, she told her tearful staff as they packed up years of research. This is the most important experiment we've ever been part of. But the real test came when Captain on Minho's cargo ship, the Soul's Pride, arrived at the Kepler system carrying something incredible. In his ship's hold was the first working prototype, an artificial ocean module, 3 kilometers wide, complete with everything the Vorthok needed to survive. Dr. Kim Gi-won floated in her spacesuit outside the massive module, checking the readings. One more time. Inside, purple water swirled in perfect currents, maintained by chemical processors that had been built in just 2 weeks. The water chemistry was exactly right, acidic, mineral-rich, and deadly to most life forms, but perfect for the Vorthok. This is it, she radioed to the human fleet. If this doesn't work, we'll know we need to try something different. A small Vorthok family had volunteered to be the first test subjects. The parents, who looked like beautiful giant squids with glowing blue skin, swam nervously toward the entrance of the artificial ocean. Their 2 children stayed close behind, their large eyes full of curiosity and fear. The whole human fleet watched in silence as the Vorthok family entered the module. Ji-won stared at her instruments, her heart pounding. The chemical sensors would tell them everything. If the Vorthok could survive, if they could thrive, if this crazy human plan had any chance of working. For 6 hours, nothing happened. The readings stayed stable, but that didn't mean much. Many alien species could survive in wrong environments for a short time before their bodies started failing. Then, slowly, the readings started to change, but not in a bad way. The Vorthok family's biosigns were getting stronger. The children were playing, swimming in loops and chasing each other through the artificial currents. The parents had found a resting spot and were actually relaxing for the first time in months. Dr. Kim called Captain on over the radio. What are you seeing? Ji-won could barely speak. Her voice was shaking as she read the incredible numbers on her screen. They're not just surviving, she whispered. They're thriving. Their health readings are better than they were in their natural ocean. The human fleet erupted in cheers that could be heard across multiple radio channels. But Ji-won was already thinking about what came next. One working module was amazing, but they needed hundreds of them, and they needed them fast. Looking at the dying planet below, she realized they had just proven the impossible was possible. Now they had to do it on a scale no one had ever imagined. The bureaucrats were going to kill the Vorthok with paperwork. Admiral Song Mingi stared at the official message that had just arrived from Coalition headquarters. Construction permit denied. Environmental impact study required. Safety inspection mandatory. Estimated processing time, 6 months. The Vorthok had 6 weeks left. Ma'am, said her aide, Lieutenant Kim Yeho nervously. The Coalition is threatening to send enforcement ships if we continue construction without permits. Song looked out at the massive construction site, where thousands of human workers were racing against time to build artificial oceans. Every hour of delay meant more Vorthok families would die. Send a message to all human ships, she said quietly. Operation paperwork is officially suspended. We're switching to Operation Right Thing. What happened next shocked the entire galaxy. Human ships stopped asking for permission and started taking what they needed. An abandoned Centaurian mining station that had been empty for decades suddenly found itself occupied by human construction crews. Old Coalition supply depots that were scheduled for demolition became material sources for the rescue effort. The Centaurian delegate, a tall alien with purple skin and way too much attitude, was furious. Admiral Song, this is outright piracy. You cannot simply seize Coalition property. Song's response during the emergency hologram meeting was ice cold. Delegate Zarthus, your people abandoned that station 15 years ago. We're putting it to good use. Your paperwork can wait. Vorthok lives cannot. Engineer Choi Daeho was leading one of the construction teams on a half-built habitat module. They had been working for 36 hours straight, welding hull plates and installing life support systems. The work was dangerous. They were cutting corners on safety protocols that would normally take weeks to approve. "Sir, Coalition safety inspectors are demanding we stop work immediately," reported welding specialist Park Sun-mi, her face covered in sweat and metal dust. Choi looked around at his exhausted team, then at the Vorthok world dying below them. "Keep working. If the inspectors want to shut us down, they'll have to physically stop us." When the Coalition inspection ships arrived the next day, they found something they had never seen before. The human construction workers had moved their families into the half-built habitats. Children were playing in the corridors, while their parents worked on life support systems. Elderly humans sat in the incomplete common areas, knitting and telling stories. Captain Lee Hoon met the lead inspector, a confused-looking Altarian official named Kethmer, at the airlock. "Captain Lee, this facility is not approved for habitation," the inspector said, checking his tablet. "These people must evacuate immediately." Lee looked around at the human families who had made the construction site their temporary home. "These aren't workers, Inspector. These are refugees who lost their homes when we converted their colonies for Vorthok construction materials." This was technically true. Many of the workers had indeed given up their homes for the rescue effort, but they had moved into the construction sites specifically to prevent Coalition interference. "You cannot house refugees in an unauthorized facility," the inspector protested. "You're right," Lee agreed. "But you also can't evict refugees during a humanitarian crisis. Galactic law is very clear about that." The inspector stared at his tablet, then at the human families, then back at his tablet. The legal contradiction was perfect. To shut down the construction, the Coalition would have to forcibly remove refugee families, which would violate their own humanitarian laws. Dr. Kim Ju-won, watching from the main habitat, couldn't help but smile. "We turned ourselves into refugees to protect the timeline," she explained to the confused Vorthok liaison. "It's completely against regulations, totally unprecedented, and absolutely brilliant." The Coalition inspectors left without shutting down a single construction site. Within days, the word spread through Coalition bureaucracy: "Don't bother sending inspectors to human construction sites." The humans had somehow made themselves legally untouchable, while breaking every rule in the book. Admiral Song received an angry message from Coalition Command demanding an explanation for the refugee loophole. Her response was simple: "We're not breaking laws. We're using them to save lives. If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe your laws need fixing." The Coalition never sent inspectors again. They learned it was easier to let the humans work than to argue with people who had turned creative rule-breaking into an art form. The construction continued without interruption, and the Vorthok countdown clock kept ticking. The red tape was going to kill 2 billion people, and Admiral Song Mingi wasn't going to let that happen. She sat in her command chair, staring at the official Coalition document that had just arrived. Construction permit application denied. Reason: insufficient environmental impact studies. New estimated approval time: 8 to 12 months. The Vorthok had exactly 38 days left before their planet became uninhabitable. "Admiral," said her communications officer, looking nervous, "the Coalition is demanding we halt all construction immediately. They're threatening to send military ships to enforce the shutdown." Song looked out at the construction zone where thousands of human workers were building artificial oceans around the clock. Every welding spark, every hull plate installed, every life support system brought online brought them closer to saving an entire species. "Lieutenant Kim," she said calmly, "send a message to all human vessels. We're no longer asking for permission." What happened next sent shockwaves through galactic politics. Human ships started showing up at abandoned Coalition facilities throughout the sector. An old Centaurian research station that had been empty for 20 years suddenly came alive with human construction crews. A forgotten supply depot became a materials distribution center overnight. The most audacious move came when Captain Park Minsiok's engineering team simply moved into an abandoned orbital platform and started converting it into a massive void habitat. They didn't ask, didn't file paperwork, didn't even send a message. They just showed up and started working. The Centaurian delegate, Zarthik, was furious when he found out. His purple skin turned an even darker shade during the emergency hologram conference with Admiral Song. "This is outright theft," he shouted, his tentacles waving angrily. "You cannot simply take coalition property and convert it for your own purposes." Song's response was delivered in a voice so cold it could freeze space. "Delegate Zarthik, that station has been abandoned since before my daughter was born. We're putting it to good use, saving lives. Your bureaucratic procedures can wait. The Vorthok children cannot." Meanwhile, engineer Choi Dae-ho was leading construction. Teams that worked in ways that would give coalition safety inspectors heart attacks. They were welding hull sections while the habitats were pressurized, installing life support systems without triple redundancy checks, and connecting power systems using methods that hadn't been approved by committees. "This is incredibly dangerous," worried safety specialist Yoon Jina as she watched welders working in conditions that violated dozens of regulations. "You know what's more dangerous?" Choi replied, pointing at the dying Vorthok planet. "Doing nothing while people die waiting for safety paperwork." The coalition's response was predictable. 3 days later, inspection ships arrived at every human construction site, ready to shut down the illegal operations. The lead inspector, a tall Altarian named Vextel, boarded Captain Lee Hyen's main construction platform expecting to find violations everywhere. What he found instead left him completely confused. The platform was full of human families. Children were playing in the corridors while their parents worked on construction projects. Elderly humans sat in the recreation areas, some knitting, others teaching alien languages to the kids. The whole place looked like a bustling neighborhood rather than a construction site. "Captain Lee," Inspector Vextel said, consulting his tablet, "this is an unauthorized construction facility. These civilians need to be evacuated immediately." Lee looked around at the families who had made the construction platform their home. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, Inspector. These aren't just workers. These are refugees." This was technically true. When humans had converted their colonies and space stations for Vorthok construction materials, many families had indeed been displaced. But instead of going to official refugee centers, they had moved directly onto the construction sites. Refugees. Vextel looked confused. "But they're living in an illegal facility." "That's correct," Lee agreed pleasantly. "But according to Galactic Humanitarian Code Section 47B, you cannot forcibly relocate refugees during an active crisis without providing alternative housing." "Do you have alternative housing for 3,000 people?" The inspector's face went through several color changes as he realized the trap. To shut down construction, he would have to evict refugee families, which would violate the coalition's own humanitarian laws. But allowing them to stay meant accepting the illegal construction. Dr. Kim Ji-won, watching from the habitat's observation deck, couldn't stop smiling. "It's beautiful," she told her assistant. "We made ourselves legally untouchable by becoming the very people we're trying to save." Young Park Soo-yoon, whose family had moved onto the construction site, tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mama, why does that blue man look so confused?" "Because, sweetie," her mother explained, "sometimes adults make rules so complicated that they forget why the rules exist in the first place." Inspector Vextel left without shutting down anything. Within hours, similar scenes played out across dozens of construction sites. Coalition inspectors arrived, ready to enforce regulations, and left scratching their heads at legal puzzles they couldn't solve. The message quickly spread through coalition bureaucracy. Don't bother with the humans. They had somehow made rule-breaking into a form of legal compliance. Admiral Song received an official complaint, demanding an explanation for the refugee stratagem. Her response was one sentence: "We're not breaking your laws, we're using them to save lives." The coalition never sent another inspector, and construction continued without interruption. The dying star wasn't following anyone's schedule. What should have been 6 weeks suddenly became 3, as massive solar flares erupted from the Kepler sun like angry fists of fire. Dr. Kim Ji-won watched the readings with growing horror as radiation levels spiked across the Vorthok homeworld. The outer settlements, where millions of Vorthok families lived in shallow coastal waters, were getting hit the hardest. "Emergency meeting, now," she called over the ship's intercom. Within minutes, the command center was packed with humans who looked like they hadn't slept in days, because they hadn't. "The star is going critical faster than we predicted," Ji-won announced, pulling up a holographic display that showed the dying sun. "These solar flares are sterilizing everything within 50 million kilometers. The radiation is so intense, it's literally boiling the outer oceans." Captain Lee Hyun studied the data with tired eyes. "How long do we have? For the deep ocean cities, maybe 2 weeks. For the outer settlements," Ji-won's voice cracked, "they need evacuation now, today." The problem was that now meant flying rescue ships directly into radiation levels that would kill most species in minutes. The outer Vorthok settlements were scattered across thousands of small islands and shallow seas that were now being bombarded with deadly solar energy. "Captain Yu?" Jin-won stood up from the back of the room. He was young for a captain, barely 30, with the kind of steady hands that made him perfect for dangerous flying. "My squadron volunteers for outer settlement evacuation," he said simply. The room went quiet. Everyone knew what that meant. The radiation levels in the outer zones were so high that even human ships, with their heavy shielding, might not survive the trips. "Captain Yu," Admiral Song's voice came through the hologram from Earth. "Those radiation levels are approaching lethal even for our best shielded vessels." "Yes, ma'am," Yu replied. "But there are Vorthok children out there who can't wait for better conditions." 6 hours later, Yu's squadron was flying toward their first target, a remote Vorthok community living in what used to be a beautiful coral reef but was now a boiling death trap. Lieutenant Kong Yun-ji, his navigator, watched nervously as the radiation alarms started beeping. "Captain, shields are down to 60%, and we're still 5 minutes out." Through the cockpit window, they could see the nightmare below. The once blue Vorthok seas were now a sickly yellow color, steaming as the star's radiation heated them past the boiling point. But in the deeper parts, Vorthok families were still huddled together, too scared to leave their ancestral homes. "Hold course," Ginwon said calmly, even as warning lights flashed all around him. "Those families aren't leaving without us." The evacuation was like something out of a nightmare. Human rescue crews in radiation suits worked frantically to load terrified Vorthok families into transport pods. The aliens' beautiful blue skin was already showing radiation burns, and their children were crying in ways that sounded heartbreaking even across species barriers. 30 more minutes, and this whole area will be uninhabitable," reported the medical officer as they loaded the last family. Behind them, barely visible in the distance, waited something that still seemed impossible, even though they had built it themselves. Massive arc ships floated in space, each one 3 times bigger than Earth's largest cities. Inside those ships were perfect artificial oceans, where 50 million Vorthok could live safely in just 3 months. Humanity had built floating worlds. The impossible had become routine, but only because humans refused to accept that anything was truly impossible when lives were at stake. "Last transport away," Jinwan reported as his ship's radiation alarms reached critical levels. "All civilians safe." As they flew back toward the arc ships, Yongji looked at the radiation readings that showed they had absorbed enough energy to kill them 3 times over. Captain, how are we still alive? Jinwan smiled tiredly. Because we're too stubborn to die when people need us. The evacuation continued around the clock, with human crews flying missions that should have been suicide runs and somehow making it work through pure determination and a refusal to give up on anyone. The star kept getting angrier, but humanity kept flying into the fire to save their new friends. The Kepler star had one final, terrible surprise for everyone. Dr. Kim Giwon was monitoring the stellar readings when her screen suddenly exploded with warnings. The star's core temperature had just spiked beyond anything they had predicted. She ran the calculations 3 times, hoping she was wrong. She wasn't. Emergency alert to all ships, she broadcast, her voice shaking. The star is beginning final collapse, 18 days ahead of schedule. Captain Lee Hayen was in the middle of evacuating a deep-sea Vorthok city when the message came through. Around him, 500,000 Vorthok families were still waiting for rescue from settlements scattered across the ocean floor. The water around them was already glowing with deadly radiation. Admiral Sung's voice crackled through the communication system from the safety of the command arc, positioned far from the dying star. All rescue ships, begin immediate emergency withdrawal. That's a direct order. Lee looked around his bridge. His crew was exhausted, their faces pale from radiation exposure that was slowly killing them. Through the viewports, he could see Vorthok parents holding their children close, trusting that the humans would save them. Negative, Admiral, Lee replied quietly. We still have civilians down here. The bridge went silent, except for the steadily increasing radiation alarms. Everyone knew what staying meant. The expanding wave of stellar death would reach them long before they could finish the evacuation. Communications. Officer Park Mina tried to keep her voice steady as she read her radiation dosimeter. Captain, we're already in the red zone. Medical says we have maybe 6 hours before. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Engineer Nam Taeyong was working frantically to keep their ship's systems running as radiation fried their electronics one by one. Hull breach on deck 7, he reported, sweat dripping down his face. Emergency containment is holding, but barely. Similar reports were coming in from all 12 ships in the rescue fleet. They were dying by degrees, but they kept working. Transport pods filled with Vorthok families launched from their bays every few minutes. Racing toward the distant Ark ships and safety, Dr. Giwon watched from the lead Ark, her heart breaking as she monitored the rescue fleet's life signs. One by one, the bio readings for the human crews were turning from green to yellow to red. They were being slowly cooked by radiation, but they wouldn't abandon their posts. Please, she whispered into her microphone, knowing they could hear her. Please come back. You've done enough. But Captain Lee's response came back immediately. Doctor, there are still 300,000 Vorthok down here. Children, families, elderly ones who can't swim fast enough to reach the transport zones. We're not leaving them. The evacuation became a desperate race between death and determination. Human rescue crews, their bodies already failing from radiation poisoning, worked with mechanical precision to load every last Vorthok transport. They moved like ghosts through their dying ships, ignoring alarms, ignoring pain, ignoring everything except the faces of the alien families who needed them. Young Vorthok children pressed their faces against the transport windows, waving goodbye to the human crews who were saving them. They didn't understand that those humans were never going home. Transport pod 847 away, Park Mina reported, her voice now just a whisper. Her hair was starting to fall out, and her hands shook as she worked her controls. Transport 848 away, came Nam Taeyong's report from engineering. He had sealed himself in the reactor room to keep the power running, knowing the radiation there would kill him in minutes. One by one, the rescue ships began going dark as their power systems finally succumbed to radiation damage. But even as they died, the crews kept working by emergency lighting, manually launching the last transport pods. Final transport away. Captain Lee's voice came over the radio one last time. All civilians safe. Tell their children. Tell them humans don't give up on friends. The rescue fleet went silent, 12 ships full of heroes who had chosen to die, rather than abandon people who needed them. Dr. Juan stared at her screens through tears, watching the transport pods racing toward safety, while the rescue ships disappeared in the expanding wave of stellar fire. 500,000 Vorthok had been saved by humans, who gave everything to make it happen. The evacuation was complete, but the cost was written in the stars. The final numbers took 3 days to calculate, and when they came in, nobody could believe them. Dr. Kim Juan stared at her tablet, reading the same line over and over again. 1,847,000,000 Vorthok successfully evacuated and relocated. She looked up at her exhausted team, then back at the screen. That's a 92% survival rate. The silence in the command center was deafening. Every other species in the galaxy had called this mission impossible. The Coalition's best scientists had estimated that maybe 10% of the Vorthok could be saved, and only if everything went perfectly. Instead, humanity had saved almost everyone. "How many did we lose?" asked Captain Parkman-Seok, who had arrived with the latest transport from Earth. Kiwan's voice was quiet. "About 153 million, mostly from the outer settlements that we couldn't reach before the radiation got too intense. Even the losses were a miracle. In any other disaster of this scale, the casualty count would have been measured in billions, not millions. But the real miracle wasn't just the numbers. It was what happened next. 6 months after the evacuation, Dr. Giwan was giving a tour to a group of alien scientists who had come to study the artificial ocean worlds. The lead scientist, a tall Altarian named Dr. Vexkari, kept stopping to stare at his readings in amazement. "This is impossible," he muttered for the 10th time. Watching young Vorthok swimming happily through artificial coral reefs, these ecosystems are more complex than their original homeworld. Jiwan smiled as she watched Vorthok children playing with human kids who lived on the Ark ships. The two species had become best friends, despite being from completely different worlds. "The secret wasn't in our technology," she explained to the confused alien scientists. "When the Coalition studied this problem, they focused on moving the Vorthok to existing habitats. They tried to make the Vorthok adapt to what was available." She pointed to a group of Vorthok adults who were working alongside human engineers to improve the water filtration systems. "We did the opposite. We asked them what they needed to be happy and healthy, then we built exactly that." Dr. Vexkari looked at his readings again. The artificial oceans had perfect chemical balance, optimized current flows that helped Vorthok swimming, and even artificial weather systems that created the storm patterns the Vorthok loved. "But how did you know what to build?" he asked. "You had never studied Vorthok biology before." Young Vorthok engineer Glubtai, who was working on a new habitat section, answered in perfect human language. "Because they asked us. The other species looked at us like a problem to solve. Humans looked at us like friends to help. The difference was everything. While the galaxy's greatest minds had focused on stellar engineering and complex physics, trying to save the Vorthok's dying star, humans had focused on building better homes for people they cared about. The results spoke for themselves. The Vorthok weren't just surviving in their new homes, they were thriving. Their population was growing, their culture was flourishing, and they had become humanity's closest allies in the galaxy. The real proof came 6 months later, when the first joint human Vorthok starship launched from the Ark shipyards. The vessel, called the New Current, combined human engineering with Vorthok ocean current technology to create something neither species could have built alone. Captain Lee Sungmin, standing on the bridge beside his Vorthok co-captain Frelenix, watched as their hybrid ship moved through space using current flow. principles that made it faster and more efficient than any vessel in the galaxy. The Coalition is calling it impossible again, Frelenix said with what humans had learned was a Vorthok laugh. They say our two species are too different to work together. Captain Lee smiled, watching human and Vorthok crew members working side by side at their stations. They said the same thing about the evacuation. The galaxy had learned an important lesson. When humans decide to help someone, they don't just save them, they make them family. And impossible becomes just another word for hasn't been done yet. 3 years had passed since the Great Evacuation, and the universe looked completely different. President Kim Soyan stood quietly in front of the memorial wall, reading the names carved into black stone. Each name represented a human who had died saving strangers from a dying world. At the top of the wall, in letters bigger than the rest, was Captain Lee Huyan. He stayed so others could live. The memorial was built on the largest Vorthok Ark ship, floating peacefully in space where the Kepler star used to shine. Now, instead of a dying sun, there were thriving cities filled with the sound of children playing, both human and Vorthok children, swimming and laughing together. "Mama, why are you crying?" asked little Park Naeong, tugging on her mother's dress. The 6-year-old had been born on one of the Ark ships, and had never known a world where humans and Vorthok weren't best friends. Her mother, Dr. Kim Giwon, wiped her tears and picked up her daughter. "I'm not sad, sweetheart. I'm proud. These people saved an entire species." What had started as an emergency rescue mission had become something nobody expected. The Vorthok ocean worlds weren't just homes anymore. They were the most advanced living spaces in the galaxy. The artificial ecosystems were so perfect that other species came from across the universe to study them. The partnership between humans and Vorthok had created technology that seemed like magic. Ships that could grow their own hull repairs using living coral. Space stations that cleaned themselves using artificial ocean currents. Habitats that produced their own food, water, and even entertainment. Coalition High Chancellor Zarthon, the same alien who had once called the human plan impossible, stood at the podium during the memorial ceremony. His blue skin looked almost embarrassed as he spoke to the crowd of humans in Vorthok. 3 years ago, my people told me the Terran approach was foolish, he admitted, his translator making his words sound formal and stiff. We focused on all the reasons why saving the Vorthok couldn't be done. You focused on figuring out how it could be done. In the audience, young Vorthok swam in portable water tanks, next to their human friends. The alien children had learned to speak perfect Korean, while the human kids could communicate in the clicking musical language of the Vorthak. 10-year-old Choi Minjin raised his hand during the question period. "Chancellor, why didn't the other species help?" The old alien looked uncomfortable. "We thought it was impossible, young human. We gave up before we tried." A young Vorthok named Blabanai, who was the same age as Minjin, clicked a response that made all the Vorthok in the audience laugh. The translator rendered it as, "Humans don't know the meaning of impossible." But the real proof of what they had accomplished came 6 months later, when emergency signals started flooding into Coalition headquarters. The Helios Plague, a spaceborne virus that destroyed entire ecosystems, was spreading through 12 star systems. Billions of lives were at risk. The Coalition called an emergency meeting. Representatives from hundreds of species gathered to debate what could be done. They formed committees, scheduled studies, and began the slow process of bureaucratic response. Then someone asked the obvious question: what do the humans think we should do? Coalition Command sent the distress signal to Earth, expecting to start weeks of negotiations and planning sessions. The response came back in 4 hours. Relief fleet launching in 6 hours. Estimated arrival in your space: 14 days. Please begin evacuation preparations. Admiral Song Minji, now in her 70s, but still running humanitarian missions, was already on her way, before the coalition had even finished reading the crisis report. How did they mobilize so quickly? Asked the amazed coalition. Emergency coordinator. The answer came from a Vorthok diplomat who had been working with humans for 3 years. Because humans don't debate whether to help people. They just help people. When the human relief fleet arrived at the plague zone, they brought something unprecedented. Mobile Vorthok ocean cities that could serve as emergency shelters for any species. The rescued had become rescuers. Young human Vorthok teams worked together using hybrid technology to contain the plague and evacuate entire planets in record time. What should have been the worst disaster in galactic history became another chapter in humanity's growing reputation. The galaxy had learned something important. When the impossible happens, you don't call committees or form study groups. You call the humans. And the humans, as always, were already loading their ships before the call came through.